Welcome back to Free Speech Nation. It seems that a Jewish person can't be interviewed by the media today without being repeatedly bashed and hounded about the actions of the Israeli government. That's what happened to the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Jake Wallis-Simons, when he was interviewed this week by Matthew Wright on his LBC show. Despite not being an Israeli government spokesperson, he was confronted with claims about Israel's secret service and repeatedly questioned about Jews killing children. Not a good look. Joining me now is not an Israeli government spokesperson, but editor of the Jewish Chronicle, Jake Wallis-Simons. Hello.
Hi.
I like your look.
How are you? Another.
So, Jake, interestingly enough, this is the first time I've ever met you.
Yeah.
Even though I've written for years for the Jewish Chronicle. Very nice to meet you.
Very nice to meet you.
I was shocked hearing the clip this week. Would you mind just explaining the lead-in, and then we'll actually play a little excerpt?
Sure. Well, ostensibly, I was invited on the programme to talk about the latest news, which is that incidents of anti-Semitism have spiked since October the 7th. I mean, this isn't really new, but it was new to LBC, at least for this programme. And also, apparently, incidents of anti-Muslim hatred spiked as well after the Southport stabbings, if you can recall that happening as well. So I was invited on to talk about that. But in his introduction, Matthew Wright disclosed that he'd located the two people to blame for this rise of anti-Semitism, and they were, amazingly enough, Nigel Farage and Alison Pearson. Farage for apparently whipping up incitement after the Southport stabbings, and Alison Pearson because she was visited by the police for tweeting something, and then the case was later humiliatingly dropped. So it came to me. I had to, defend Alison and Farage. Farage because he questioned the police when they said it wasn't a terror incident. Later on, we found out that it was. I mean, he was charged with a terror offence and was found in possession of an Al-Qaeda manual. And Alison because she hadn't done anything wrong. So I defended them and tried to get onto the subject at hand, but he wouldn't let it go. He was determined to talk about how the media was to blame for this anti-Semitism. And so we ended up getting into a debate about the media depictions of Israel and so forth. I put across my point of view, which was that the media, the mainstream media, as it's called, is largely complicit in pumping propaganda into people's homes by parroting Hamas figures, which edit out any terrorist casualties, and also airing Hamas-censored material, which only shows civilian casualties, no terror casualties, giving people the impression that this is a genocide rather than a war. And he didn't like that and insisted on knowing how many children had been killed.
Well, at this point, I'd like to listen to that little clip where we get to.
So how many children have been killed by Israeli forces then?
Look, I can tell you that if you look at the report that came out last week, it showed that the Hamas figures were fabricated.
How many? I just want to know what the accurate Jewish figure is.
What I can say. The Jewish figure? What do you mean by that?
Well, the figure that you as a Jewish man want to put out there, the official figure, not the Hamas figure.
I'm not sure that the Jewish figure is really the best way of phrasing this, Matthew, but...
well, any figure.
See, now that would have me throwing my radio across the room if I'd heard it. Could you sort of talk us through why that is so insanely offensive?
The Jewish figure, I mean, it doesn't sound brilliant, does it? It makes your skin crawl when you hear the Jewish figure. I think it sort of suggests that this is a racialized debate, that we're not simply talking about, how many people have tragically been killed in Gaza in a war which was started by Hamas, and trying to get to the truth of this. But it's got a racial component. It's about Jews. It's about Jews and killing. And Jews and killing and children. He, after that, emphasised how many children had been killed. In fact, in that debate, you heard him emphasising how many children had been killed. And funnily enough, the discussion went on to talk about other causes of anti-Semitism in Britain. And I pointed out that there are these underlying anti-Semitic tropes in our culture, such as the blood libel, in which Jews are depicted as relishing killing children, and that started in 1144 in Norwich when Jews were accused of killing a small child, and it's been in the bloodstream, so to speak, ever since, the cultural bloodstream, people naturally having a sense that Jews just like killing children, they can't help themselves. And it seemed to sort of resonate when Matthew continually asked me and demanded to know, even though I don't speak on behalf of the Israeli government, I'd come on to talk about anti-Semitism figures in Britain, sort of insisted on demanding I tell him how many children the Jews had killed.
Yeah,
so
that's what I took from it. And it seemed, like you say, that he was somewhat obsessed or caught on this particular point. And the irony being that you're there, I guess, to talk about how anti-Semitism is propagated. And he's doing it as you're talking about it. But of course, and not to say that he is even conscious of these things, because they are so sort of deep down within our culture.
I think the whole thing really pointed to how effective this propaganda has been. Hamas producing it and the media amplifying it willy-nilly across the world with all the power at their disposal. I mean, the fact that nobody in the media, or very, very few, I think maybe 3 to 5% of reports about Gaza have cited the Israeli figures, which are about half the combatants are terrorists. But the 98% of reports have been articulating Hamas propaganda, which is that they're all women and children, 70% women and children, and the combatants have simply vanished. This stuff is really pernicious, and it's affected people's minds. And when that's combined with the fact that the BBC and others don't produce a health warning saying the following footage has been censored by Hamas, that's why there are no terrorists in the footage, only dead and dying civilians or suffering civilians. These things give viewers the impression they've seen with their own eyes that a genocide is happening. And when you put the figures in front of them, the facts in front of them, they say, no, it can't be. And it keys into this cultural unconscious, which is that the Jews just can't help themselves but love killing and deception, and particularly killing children. I think that's what we saw to some extent working its way up in that interview.
Yeah, look, I want to be fair to Matthew Wright. I don't know him. And just as a broadcaster, I mean, I've only worked in television for a relatively short time. But one of the things I guess I've learned is that, and this is a bit of a secret, but sometimes the people who are on telly in these kind of shows don't know that much about what they're talking about. Now, this is something I happen to know a lot about, but there are other times where it is, in his case, he's catching snippets here or there from social media, as you say, Hamas propaganda, and saying, I read this thing one place. It then can obviously tie into their underlying prejudices. But it's sort of very frustrating when these facts, it is available, this kind of information out there as to, as you say, this idea that this fact that at the moment it's a one-to-one casualty, civilian casualties to combatant, which is the lowest ever, including, with the UK Army's history.
That's right. I mean, I wouldn't like to reach into his soul and say that I know that this man is an anti-Semite or anything like that. But it's interesting that he quickly managed to turn what was supposed to be a discussion about rising anti-Semitism figures in Britain. These are police figures, so anti-Semitic crime across Britain. And suddenly he turned it into a hostile interrogation about the number of children that are being killed in Gaza, seemingly without any self-awareness that this was a bad look. And yes, maybe he didn't know about the Hamas figures, the details, the intricacies of the casualty ratio and so on and so forth. But that wasn't what we were there to talk about. We were there to talk about something entirely different. And the fact that he happily brought it into a kind of Today programme style interrogation of me about something that was totally irrelevant just rather proved the point of the whole thing.
Yeah, I mean, well, look, you spoke out about it, and hopefully people will bring more people to the attention of what are facts, but it's very frustrating out there. I don't know if you saw a thread that, speaking of the BBC, and I don't want to just BBC bash because, I'm on GB News and now I'm going to BBC bash about it, but these tactics are not dissimilar to what happened to the BBC recently, where they had a rabbi on, they also had an imam on, and they had someone from a church on, and then you saw it was sort of broke down how they sort of dealt with each person. And when it came to the rabbi, suddenly they were like doing pretty much what happened to you, where it's all about the figures and whatever, and the other religious people weren't treated that way at all. So this is across the board. This isn't Matthew Wright specifically. This is across media.
Yeah, that was Rabbi Gideon Sylvester speaking to the BBC about Hanukkah, alongside a priest and an imam. And as the investigative journalist David Collier first pointed out, the priest and the imam were both given a very easy time of it. And while they were speaking, B-roll, other footage played of peaceful scenes of nativity and whatever, that sort of thing. But when it came to the rabbi, the tone was very hostile. And the footage that was played alongside him was of tanks and war and aggression. And he actually felt that he'd been ambushed. He complained to the BBC producer. And as the Jewish Chronicle revealed a couple of days ago, the BBC producer actually sent him an apology. He felt that he wasn't, he'd treated him unfairly in setting him up for that kind of interview that was carried out by Ben Brown, I think it was, in that kind of way. So I think that sometimes there is a perception of these double standards when it comes to Jews, Jewish figures, religious figures, journalists like myself, other people. We find ourselves having to bat away accusations of genocide before we've even drawn breath. And I guess that just proves the climate today in Britain today. And that was what I got on to talk about in the first place.
OK, well, it's not going to happen on Free Speech Nation. Thank you very much for joining us. Jake Wallis-Simon's there. Well, I like those glasses. I think I'll get those for next week.